Okay, welcome everyone. We're just going to give everyone else a minute more to join and then we'll get started. Okay, seems like a lot of people have now trickled in, so we'll go ahead and get going. So I'm Matt Durnin from Nous Group. I'm joined by John Chu from Navitas. Uh, our presentation today, this session is on the report that we recently released, an updated survey of international education leaders that we did across uh, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, and we had some respondents from the US as well. This is a follow-on from a report that we did in 2022. We John and I conceived the survey and decided to run it at that time because coming out of the pandemic, we felt like our clients in the sector were dealing with some really unique challenges on the back of the pandemic and wanted to understand how the sector was viewing those challenges and how they were responding to them. And given the very substantial policy changes that we've had over the last couple of years, we thought uh, late 2024 was a great time to rerun that survey and see how thinking in the sector had evolved and was changing at that time. The survey captures that period just after that most recent round of regulatory tightening in Canada and also captures, I think, just before we got a little more clarity on what the near term was going to look like for Australia. So probably captures a little bit more uncertainty, but we um, fairly similar sentiments to what we've picked up since for Australia, I would say. John can come in later if that's incorrect. Um, just wanted to do a quick land acknowledgement. John, if you wouldn't mind to flip to the next slide. Just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and acknowledge that many of you are dialing in from various other places that are traditional lands of other peoples. Go to the next slide, please, John. At a really high level, I'll just talk through the 6 key findings that we're going to touch on today. Also wanted to say that we have a Q&A at the end of the session. If you want to type in questions into the Q&A function, that's probably the easiest way for us to sort them. If you're having trouble with that, maybe type something in the chat and we'll work that out. The 6 key themes from the report this year are one that we see internationalization is still a high priority for universities, but this is obviously being influenced a lot by government policy at the moment. Second, revenue is very front of mind for universities across all the major study destinations, particularly amid tougher financial conditions on the home front and intensifying competition as well. Third, we think we saw that universities expect to increase revenue through a variety of means. They're looking at raising their tuition fees beyond probably inflationary adjustments. We're seeing some intention to reduce scholarships and bursaries. And also for a select group of institutions that we'll dig into further, we're seeing some intention to lower entry requirements. Fourth, we do see universities expecting to decrease investment across many key areas of international student recruitment and partnership, and that's a pretty big reversal from what we saw in 2022. We'll dig into that more later in the presentation. And 5, definitely seeing a resurgence of interest in transnational education, offshore delivery of academic programs, though not a consistently high level of confidence that from our respondents that their institutions understand how to execute that well. And 6, while we did pick up some pretty broad pessimism in the survey, there is, I think, John and I will touch on some reasons for there being an optimistic outlook in a lot of ways for the sector as a whole. All right, I'll turn it over to Jon to talk us through uh, the first section.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt, and great to be with all of you. Thanks for giving up the time and participating in this webinar. This is a really timely survey in many ways, and we're really pleased that we were able to do it. Really pleased that we had just over 200 respondents, directors, pro-vice chancellors, deputy vice chancellors from public institutions across those four major English-speaking destinations that Matt mentioned. And I think in particular for the UK, Canada, US, and Australia, we are going through a pretty significant transition when it comes to the international education sector. And to illustrate this point, this idea of slowbalization and this transition from the market era to the managed era, I'll just share with you this chart, which is a measure of trade openness, and it's effectively how much trade there is around the world throughout history, going back to the 1870s. You see a big dip in the period of the two world wars, and then a strong rebound after that. And more recently, from 1980 onwards, a period of globalization and hyperglobalization. Just to note, around sort of 1976, I think Ontario was the first province in Canada and probably the first in the world actually to introduce international student fees that were different from domestic student fees. So the differentiation fees or the fee differential started there and then took place UK in about 1980, Australia in the mid 1980s. And that sort of coincided with this period of globalization and hyperglobalization. As the title of the report alludes to, we're now in a period of what the economists and other publications and research refer to as a period of slowbalization, deglobalization, or even perhaps more recently, anti-globalization. It started with Brexit, and it's really, hitting its stride now with tariffs. And just really quickly, just to give you a sense of the broad underlying drivers of this period of globalization, there's been rising inequality, which has led to increasing nationalism and nativism. And you see this play out most acutely in the housing crises that we're seeing in many OECD countries. Uh, Insufficient housing or undersupply of housing equals uh, fewer migrants, please. And that's kind of how it's playing out quite significantly now, I know in Canada, but also in Australia, where I think we're going to have an election just 5 days after our federal elections, just 5 days after yours. Supply chain disruption, we saw these very tightly linked supply chains. They got really shut down, and the vulnerabilities of those supply chains became really apparent with COVID, of course, and also with the Evergrande getting stuck in the canal. That's led to a decoupling and a reduction in trade or a reduction in offshoring. And of course, geopolitics and the ongoing, I guess, tensions and conflicts between the two superpowers of China and the USA. That's led to all sorts of national security overlays on policies, on research, on travel, all sorts of far-reaching consequences as a result of that. And of course, not just that, but what's playing out in the Middle East and Ukraine as well. So let's go to the survey results. What did our respondents say back in 2022 when we undertook the first iteration of this survey in response to the question, how would you rate the significance of the following risks to your university's internationalization agenda? You can see sort of ranked from highest to lowest there on the chart. At the very top, macroeconomic conditions, geopolitical tensions, anti-immigration sentiment. Very much in keeping with that anti-globalization or slowbalization theme, and some other sort of more common issues around academic integrity, pandemics, fraudulent applications and the like, showing up a bit lower down the list. So if we fast forward or cast forward to today and the current survey that we've published, same question, how would you rate the significance of the following risks? You can see, again, it's very much, and some of these have actually gone up in terms of percentage, in terms of those that would rate these risks as very or extremely significant. Um, Macroeconomic conditions still up there, anti-immigration sentiment, geopolitical tensions. Throw into that mix rising interest in alternative study destinations and the declining interest in international study more broadly. So I think, yeah, very much in keeping with that theme of a transition from that period of open markets, free movement of people, welcoming policies for international students to caps, greater regulation, higher costs, which are, all part and parcel of that managed era. So that's the sort of backdrop and the context, and that's what the university leaders in this survey have told us, that they are adapting their approach in this transition. And there's a non-trivial question here around, is this going to be uh, a one-off, a short-term change, or is this period of upheaval and uncertainty actually going to be uh, part of a longer term trend, a more structural change, because international education is a product of the times, and these global cultural, social, and economic challenges are actually semi-permanent, or at least, another era that we'll have to work through rather than a flash in the pan of 1 or 2 years of headwinds. So that, of course, has some big implications for the leaders, and they talk to us a lot about the financial realities and challenges, which I'll let Matt talk through in this next section.
Thanks, John. Yeah, the financial challenges came through very clearly in the survey this year. I think a lot of the respondents and then the free text answers at the end really focused on the shift in government policy. Um, I don't think any of us would disagree that that's been very challenging across the board for universities in the Anglophone study destinations. I would say I think underlying that is a pretty substantial structural shift in where we've seen international recruitment originating from, with stagnation in outbound study from China, and really that end of growth in what was a premium segment of international study. That while there's tremendous growth opportunity, we are feeling that shift away from what was an incredibly rapidly growing economy, driving a lot of the growth to more price-sensitive markets. So while I think it's fair to put some of the blame on the policy changes, we're looking at some underlying structural changes in international recruitment that are also uh, reverberating around the sector and likely driving some of the policy change considerations as well. So in terms of some of the changes between our last survey and this one, so in terms, we've got 2022 compared to 2024 across a lot of these, and one new question at the end that I'll cover. But in terms of whether internationalization is a high priority at the respondents' university, slight softening of this from 2022 to 2024 um, in the agree columns. In terms of whether internationalization is well supported across senior levels of my university, we saw a pretty substantial softening in the strongly agree category, relatively steady at the next step down. In terms of whether internationalization is well resourced, pretty steady from last year, I think, but worth noting that was still fewer than half of the respondents agreeing or strongly agreeing with that statement, unchanged from the previous survey for the most part. And a new question we put in this year in terms of whether the international ambitions at the respondents' university are increasingly influenced by government policy, and we saw just under half of respondents agreeing with that. I did realize I didn't give you any kind of background to the survey respondents at the beginning of the presentation. If you've read the report, you probably saw those stats, but just briefly from memory, it was around 200 respondents. Most of our respondents were director level or above, so relatively senior level respondents. What also came through the survey is that revenue is very front of mind and that there are pretty intense financial pressures that are driving decision making around international as well. You can go to the next slide, John. Um, so in terms of where we saw the changes, we did see and this is rank order. So if you're having trouble reading those, if it's a little bit small on your screen right now, I'll just say that. So the first column, increasing international student revenue, and this is a rank order choice about how important it was to the university's uh, international recruitment strategy at the moment. So those top green bars are a first place rank, the light blue second place rank, third, and then fourth, and that kind of dark color at the bottom. So we did see an increasing emphasis on revenue as a driver, as a top consideration in international strategy. We saw a slight softening in terms of increasing volume, so more emphasis on revenue than volume. Pretty steady on student quality, and then finally on diversity, international student diversity, we saw a slight softening there. I think the reality that a lot of my clients have reckoned with is that while seemed very desirable to broaden the number of countries they were recruiting international students from in the post-pandemic, what we did see is that acquisition costs climbed substantially along with that strategy, and that conversion rates dropped pretty substantially as well. So we're still seeing universities reckon with those realities. In response to these conditions, we saw that universities are expecting to increase revenue through raising fees, reducing scholarships, and in some cases lowering entry requirements. If we go on to the next slide, at how that's playing out by ranking band. So from left to right, we've got QS top 100, 100 to 200, 200 to 400, and then institutions that were outside of the QS top 400. So you can see that we have quite a few in the top row who, in terms of the proportion that are going to implement fee increases over 5%. So much stronger intention to do that if you're QS top 100. Roughly similar picture for all ranking bands below that. I think for the most part, at least from the universities that I've worked with across all the major study destinations in the last year, I think most had already um, more or less caught up to inflation in terms of sticker prices, but we are starting to see some intention to raise beyond that. Um, some intention in the next row down to be less generous with scholarships, relatively stronger intention in the QS top 200, those two buckets, less so in the bottom two. I think what we saw before, post-pandemic is particularly as Australian universities first wanted to push back out into market after having the borders closed for a while, we saw pretty intense discounting tactics employed, even for relatively high ranked institutions. That spread to the UK. I feel like to some degree that spread to Canada, less so to the US. But we've seen in the post pandemic, more in this environment, more universities trying to roll back discounting through scholarships and bursaries. I think what we're seeing here is a recognition that lower ranked institutions are just going to struggle to do that. But where we have seen discounting practices grow amongst more highly ranked institutions, that we're going to see some rollback there, or at least an intention to. And then finally, in terms of those who would look at implementing lower entry requirements, a very little intention to do that in our top 100 respondents, relatively more in the middle ground, interestingly, in the 100 to 200 QS ranking band and 200 to 400. If we go to the next slide, please, John. This isn't from the survey, but this is from some other client, just some generalizations from some other client engagement that we've done. Here we're looking at an aggregation of 5 UK universities that are kind of middle ranked institutions in terms of QS ranking. Um, and I just think this breakdown helps illustrate the challenges that a lot of universities are facing. What this is lifetime acquisition costs for undergraduate students and how that breaks down. Um, and if these numbers look exaggerated to you, it's because what we're also seeing that's not reflected in the chart is relatively high levels of attrition, of student attrition at these universities and non-continuation. So that's eating away at the denominator and inflating some of these other numbers. But if we take that headline tuition fee number across these institutions that we worked with, about 25% of that headline tuition fee was going to scholarships and bursaries over a lifetime for students. Um, Agent and partner fees and marketing, about 15%, direct staff costs, just about 4%. And that was leaving 56% of the headline fee. What's interesting in this case is that for several of these institutions, that was actually only a couple hundred, 100 to 200 pounds more than and what they were making net on, sorry, what the domestic tuition fees were. So we're seeing that kind of net position on international students sinking to a level comparable to what domestic fee students were. And while it's hard to offer universities to get a very clear picture on what actual delivery costs are, we know that in many of those cases we were losing money on domestic delivery. So we know those margins are getting incredibly thin, even without getting very far down into the data.
Just a quick question for you, Matt. I mean, I know this is based on the UK universities, but have you seen similar sort of issues play out in Canada?
Yes, in some cases. I think it varies a lot by faculty and tuition fee level, obviously. I think the challenging thing that I've seen is very few universities have a clear picture of where they stand on acquisition costs, and particularly the net position on students, and or at least they're not able to dig very far down into that. When we've worked with universities, it's taken quite a bit of work to get to a number that everyone's comfortable with, and it's often the margin is a lot tighter than what institutions initially think it is. In this environment, universities are reducing their investment in some key areas, is what we picked up in the survey. One of the most striking to me reversals from 2022 to 2024 is in 2022, we saw a really strong intention to a pretty notable intention to increase investment in agent aggregators and digital recruitment platforms. Much less so this time. Some of that, a lot of universities adopted it, but not a large portion of our respondents saying they're going to do that in the future. And a notable minority looking at divesting in those areas. I think that some challenges in those platforms delivering what they had promised, not speaking about any specific providers, but we have seen some compliance issues, particularly in the UK with UK clients around some of the aggregator platforms. Some challenges there and decreasing interest in investing further in those. A relatively similar picture on agent commissions and incentives. A small minority looking to lower those, but overall, pretty strong intentions to remain the same. We did have a portion that we're looking at raising those. Those are typically, we've seen in lower ranked institutions, a stronger intention to increase agent incentives in what is a hyper competitive market. The most striking finding from the survey this year is the box in the middle. We saw much higher intentions to decrease investment in marketing and recruitment staff. I think this is challenging, I think, if you're working in an international office to entertain at the moment, having to deliver on targets in a very challenging environment and likely, in many cases, having to do it with fewer resources as cost-cutting measures have um, impacted the international office as well. I think particularly notable if we go back to thinking about that previous slide where we saw, that the actual core staff costs represent a very small portion of the acquisition costs, but that's where often the cuts are being made first. Similarly, though, we are seeing budgets affected. We're seeing lower investment in marketing and promotion activities, those budgets being cut as well. Um, Also, and I think a very interesting time where we're starting to see um, AI really change search behavior as well. So I think a lot of institutions are starting to get their heads around how um, search engine optimization is less important now, and we're starting to see students finding course information through Perplexity, through ChatGPT, through these generative engine options, and I think businesses as in general just getting their heads around what it means to shift from an SEO focus to what I think is more commonly called a geo focus now. So a challenging time to cut budgets, and when we're also seeing a shift in how students are accessing um, uh, materials around university study options as well. And then finally, we did see some decreased investment intention around growing international students from countries where they're underrepresented in the university. Again, that comes back to, I think, challenges with acquisition costs and broadening the engagement portfolio, that decreasing marketing spend, that all comes together to say that we'd like to do that. It's just much harder to do. I'll stop there and turn it over to John to talk us through some of the findings around transnational education.
Thanks, Matt. Just a final comment on this slide, on that final column around growing international students or from countries that are underrepresented, or in shorthand, diversification strategies. I think that's also taken a hit, particularly in Australia and Canada, where the caps, or in Australia's case, de facto caps, we're not allowed to call them caps, have come in, and I think that's really um, pushed institutions to focus on, in keeping with this theme, the countries and source markets that generate the lowest costs and the highest yields, rather than chasing growth and diversification as we'd seen previously. On to T&E. If Well, it feels like everyone is talking about T&E, and I think that is probably indeed the case. And we included quite a few extra questions in here, in the survey this year, around the theme of T&E. Not all of them are in the report, but these are the headlines which I'll call out. So, number one, my university will be increasing its focus on transnational education. You've got 88% there strongly agree. So it is indeed the case that there's a huge focus now at the moment on T&E opportunities. Uh, I'll come. I'll skip to the bottom in the interest of time. The last row in this chart. My university has the skills and capabilities to successfully execute, and this is a much lower proportion, fewer than half of the institutions or the respondents would say, yes, we've got the skills and capabilities to match our ambitions. So I think that's a pretty telling challenge for these university leaders. Um, the middle two questions we also ask in the next slide, so I'll jump to that. In terms of the types of options or models around T&E, we've got listed there, more or less from most popular or most attractive to least attractive. So I'll just move from left to right. Offshore pathways, that's over 70%, 75% would say is attractive, very attractive, somewhat attractive for offshore pathways. A little bit lower, but pretty well the same for joint and dual award. study hubs and joint institutes after that, followed by franchise third-party arrangements, and then at about 47%, somewhat attractive, very attractive, branch campuses. So that's at the towards the right-hand side there. Um, I think that's quite unsurprising. I think it really has to do with the significant challenges and capital investments, and again, the skills and capabilities required to pull off a branch campus. I think we went through a period of about a decade of pretty muted developments in that area, but it does seem to be picking up again. So that 47% is actually higher than what we saw in the previous survey. So the interest is a bit lower on that one, but certainly growing. The final two columns there are around hybrid delivery and pure online in the very final column. We've just set them out, to the side because they're sort of in a slightly different category in themselves. What we're seeing here is a strong interest in hybrid, so online, offshore, in combination or in tandem with some sort of in-person component. And in fact, the lowest of all of these options is pure online. And again, I think this is an interesting development in terms of many institutions, many universities have had a crack at the pure online market, and probably discovered that even with really good partners, it's not an easy place to break into, and it's by its nature, because it is online, because it is global, it's extremely competitive. So yeah, in some ways, surprising that online is so unpopular, but in some ways, if you account for recent experience, perhaps not so surprising that that's being looked at with a bit more skepticism and a bit more realism around how challenging it is to make that work. Before I hand back to Matt to sort of wrap us up and take us into the home stretch on the presentation, just wanted to remind everyone, if you wanted to use the chat or Q&A function, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end.
And John, before we pop to the next slide on that point, we did have a question in the chat whether the data we were looking at represented all 5 countries, respondents from all 5 countries, and it does. I just wanted to say something really quick about how sentiment generally breaks down across those. What we've seen, I think, fair to say that the UK was by far the most active in the transnational education space in the decade before the pandemic. We had generally seen at least Australian universities wind down some of their activity, at least some of the larger scale activity from kind of the 2011 period till before the pandemic. Um, the UK also went through a period of looking at what they had actually achieved through transnational education, and there was a lot of skepticism, I think, in the couple of years before the pandemic about what had worked, what had actually worked very well. And there was, I think, a process of rationalization and kind of focusing on some models that had worked better than others. Interestingly, the pandemic did, I think, reverse some of those trends, because those institutions that had large offshore presences managed to they benefited a lot from it in the near term in the pandemic. And I think that was that, coupled with some more restrictive practices around student immigration, really pushed UK institutions to aggressively pursue T&E opportunities again. And the immigration, we'll talk about the caps and some possible carve-outs for T&E transfers through them, really reignited some interest in Australia as well. We've since seen, at least from the Nous side, we've seen a pickup in interest in Canada as well. John, I don't know if you have anything to add to that. Okay. All right, we'll try to end the formal presentation on an optimistic note, but we have to look at some pretty pessimistic stats first. If you want to go to the next slide, John. Um, yeah, we'll get to the optimistic part, but first the pessimistic stats. In terms of the proportion who were optimistic about the future of international education at their university, pretty sharp drop off for Australia, 82% to 49% from 2022 to 2024. A softer decline for the UK. That's largely because our survey, just remembering the timeline, we had seen the UK float the idea of caps, government change, and then that taken off the table. So it was a bit of a sense that they had dodged a bullet. Canada, pretty sharp decline as well, 80% to 45%. New Zealand, the lone optimist in the group, going up 84% to 90%. In terms of the proportion who were optimistic about the future of international ed in their country, massive drop off in Australia, 90% 22%, relatively unchanged in the UK. Similarly, a huge drop, 57 percentage point drop in Canada, 80% to 23%. And again, New Zealand actually reversing course there. So how do we end this, given that, on an optimistic note? I think that what we see is that while these are challenging conditions, there's also a lot of opportunity for universities to adapt their approaches. Put that in kind of four buckets where we're seeing universities have comparatively more success. One is paying a lot closer attention to student acquisition costs. That is a mix of looking at new models of operating, leveraging digital tools and platforms, and ways to both reduce recruitment costs and enhance the student experience. Um, where possible, I think making the case to invest more in student retention. I think when you really look at the numbers and to the extent to which non-continuation has become a problem with international students in a lot for a lot of our clients, focusing on that can have more benefit from a financial perspective than new student recruitment can in many cases. And I think reassessing the core skills for international teams. I think the world's changing. The way students find information about universities is changing. The application behaviors are changing. It's a good time for us to rethink how we structure and deploy teams to recruit students. And then finally, there is a lot of untapped opportunity in offshore in transnational education, saying that we'll close by saying that there is tremendous potential. It's a long journey from the lessons of others, but something that should be approached with caution. But I think it's a very interesting time, particularly for our North American colleagues, to have a look at what realistically is possible in that space, given some limitations in the current environment. So we'll leave it there and take some questions if you have them.
While we're waiting for questions to come in, Matt, I'll kick off with one to get the ball rolling. So please feel free to jump into the Q&A to pop your questions in there. Just a question for you, Matt, around I guess the demand side of the equation. So we're hearing a lot from the university leaders and what they think is going on and what their priorities are. There's a pretty clear picture in Canada in particular, but also emerging in Australia, where demand is just really soft. And I wonder if you could you made a couple of comments before about China and what's going on there. But in terms of that sort of broader top of funnel demand challenge that we're seeing, how much of that is tied to the policies of the managed era and just the bad vibes coming through? How much of it is other issues, affordability, economic conditions probably is the big one that I think of. What's your assessment?
Yeah, I think a few things happened on the demand side that are really important to understand. One is, prior to the pandemic, I was all projecting that we would likely see a leveling off in demand from China. It was just due to happen for demographic reasons, for economic growth reasons, because we were seeing, massive improvements in the quality of Chinese higher education. Um, I think when I got pushback on that, it was often because there was potentially a large untapped market beyond the eastern developed areas of China that could be a second wave of new growth. So the next China was just more China. Um, I think we're starting to see that become a reality. But the challenge is, and I've always said it, what the challenge would be with that population is it's not like what we experienced from the eastern coastal kind of more developed parts of China, in that they're more price sensitive. English language capability tends to be lower. Um, and we're seeing that very clearly in the agent feedback. When I speak to agents, we've gone from an environment where it was 0 to 5% of students they were reporting as price sensitive to seeing this more in the kind of 25, 30, 35% or even more of students coming through the major agents, showing some pretty strong signs of being price sensitive. So it's a very different market. I think we have to reflect on the fact that when you look at everything from student accommodation to the pricing of programs, we really developed it on the back of this massive growth in Chinese outbound study. Um, the demand is still, I think, there on the ground. It's just shifting to countries where it's more challenging for us to address, both from a price point perspective, from a visa compliance perspective. And I think that's what we're really battling with at the moment. The demand is there. It's just whether it fits with the models that we've developed. We have a couple of questions in the chat now. This one might be a good way, a good one for you, John. So Harriet asks, why do you think that pathways are more interesting than joint ventures?
Yeah, great question. And I'm not sure I've got a compelling response to this, but this is in response to the T&E questions where we ask about, which models are attractive or not attractive. You'll recall on that slide, pathways is the most attractive out of the different models. I think going back to Matt's question, I think part of it was really positive, Matt's comments earlier, really positive experiences during COVID with those institutions that had offshore pathways. They could still take in the students. They could say, sorry, borders are closed at the moment. Would you like to start offshore and then come through to our institution? I think those models gave universities the greatest amount of control over sort of quality and flexibility and communications. They still became a student of the university from the get-go. It probably also sort of allowed them to, uh, in addition to greater control, have that flexibility and that option for students without giving up the sort of revenue share or the governance or academic sort of standards that you might have to contend with when you're going into a joint venture with a local institution. So that would be sort of my guess. I also think it's potentially a small stepping stone for TNE where maybe you have bigger aspirations for a branch campus. An offshore pathway operation might be a good place to start. But Matt, I don't know if you've got a take on that sort of contrast.
Um, yeah, no, pretty similar view from me. Just in interest of time, we might move on to the next question. Karen asks if, do you have any data on which countries' institutions are interested in setting up their T&E? I'll take a first pass at that, John, if you want to come in as well. In terms of demand from foreign institutions or partners and, foreign countries that are actively shopping for foreign universities to come in, I think what we've seen is a pretty substantial shift away from kind of the obvious strategic options and kind of traditional options in T&E, where it was very much focused on Malaysia, on China. China always having been a very difficult market for T&E in terms of the delivery requirements. We started the kind of ones that come to universities and that come to me looking for universities to partner with. It's often coming from Saudi. Obviously, there's a huge amount of growth in higher investment in higher education and demand from institutions for foreign partners there. Quite a bit from the stands, Azerbaijan, Egypt, as well. I think with a lot of those, what I would note though, to me, the challenge with that kind of listing of countries is that um, if it's your first substantial T&E venture, does it make sense for you to be in Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan? Is that a strategic play? And I think that's a question you have to answer by as an individual institution. But I think that's the challenge is that we probably from for most universities, the opportunities 10 years ago, there were still some really large plays in large markets. We could spend a whole session talking about India and the opportunity versus challenges there, but there aren't as many as I see it large strategic market opportunities for big plays. And what we're seeing more likely in the T&E space is portfolios of a lot of smaller, lower risk, more kind of sustainable models across a broader portfolio. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just really quickly, we did actually ask the question to our respondents, which countries are you looking at? That's one of the questions we didn't publish in the report. And I can tell you the top four were India, China, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And then there's quite a big drop off. I think quite a large variety of other countries were mentioned, including all of those that Matt's just talked about, but they were the big four in the survey.
The next question we had is most students were using international education as a way to migration and permanent residency. Uh, with T&E traction is gone, how would this factor into T&E growth? My quick answer on that is, yeah, it's not an easy substitute, and I think that's what we've learned from transnational education over the last couple decades. It's funny if you go back, like early in my time working with universities, every business case we did on a transnational education project, number one question to answer was, will this cannibalize our onshore recruitment? And that was the number one concern always. And of course, what we learned is that was never the case. These were very distinct populations with very little overlap. And I think that is the challenge. And where people are getting it wrong is making an assumption that you're going offshore to deliver to the same students. And it's actually a very different subset of student population. John, did you have anything to add to that?
Yes, totally agree, Matt. If I use the example of we operate a partnership where we run the Edith Cowan University campus in Sri Lanka. I don't know the exact stats off the top of my head, but it would be upwards of 95% of the student population there are local Sri Lankan students looking for tertiary education. So it's not a migration motivated market. It's a domestic uh, education and economic mobility motivated market. So as you say, very different.
Next question we have is from Bonnie Patterson. Hi, Bonnie. Given everything we're hearing about shortages of highly qualified labor with lower immigration level, did you gain any insight through the survey about what areas of study are likely declining or of increasing interest amongst international students? John, did you want to take that first?
Yeah, we didn't ask a question specifically on sort of fields or discipline bodies, so that's not in the survey, but just perhaps a broader comment and going back to where we started around the managed era. I'm anticipating that we will see more government intervention and more government policies that will I guess, try to attract students into particular disciplines and occupations because of the skill shortages that you refer to. So I think stay tuned for more. We did see this in Australia for a brief period. For about 12 months, if you decided to come to Australia as an international student to study in nursing, teaching, IT, or engineering, those were sort of in demand areas. You would get, I think it was an additional 2 years of post-study work rights. So that was short-lived, and then we got into the whole too many students, too many migrants debate here in Australia, following after what happened in Canada. So that was unfortunate, but Suffice to say, yeah, I expect that government will start telling us what these areas of shortages will be and start to actually try to quite, deliberately influence the choices of students in that regard.
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult reality, I think, for universities to accept. But increasingly, I think we're going to have to see our activities aligned with immigration policy rather than student demand in many cases. We've done some. I think we put out a report last year. Now, instead using study portals and Lightcast data, that was very interesting to see job market demand in the major study destinations um, uh, versus student demand and how those were drifting apart in certain areas. I think the other thing that we've picked up on, I think from a policy perspective, what all the major study destinations have really struggled with is really getting good mileage for the economy and for students out of post-study work. It's been a huge part of the attraction for students. We've seen very little investment in actually making sure that students land in good jobs that are, build on their study. Um, Australia, I think, is the only of the major study destinations that I'm aware of that really invested at any point in a substantial way in promoting international graduates to industry. And they did that on a pilot program. It wasn't huge, but with small and medium-sized enterprises, it did have some really powerful case studies come out of that because that's a sector that isn't typically aware of what the employment options are for students on post-study work, but could also benefit a lot from that workforce. I think it's also worth noting that if you look at the volatility in policy around international students in terms of post-study work, um, despite the tumultuous situation in the US at the moment, the US has always been very steady in terms of its post-study work policy. And that's because it's always been really well aligned to some key industry demand. So it's basically the policy was written by Microsoft executives. So the largest sponsors of post-study work in the US are Amazon, Microsoft, Google. You have some of the most powerful companies in the US lobbying constantly for continuation of that policy. And that's something we've struggled more to do in the other study destinations. So I think it's something to keep in mind in terms of what we're lobbying in terms of policy, that we're doing that in a very coordinated way with industry, that industry can clearly see the benefits and the powerful voices in industry can help make the case for us. And it's not just universities doing that. I don't see any other questions in the chat. We can give you just a minute if anyone else wants to put something else in.
I'll just call out quickly 2 points there that you just made, Matt, which I think are worth sort of reiterating. I think number one, universities will have to start to come to grips with this idea that even though these are international students, and in Australia, I think it's 84% of them eventually go home. I think in Canada, it's more like 80% will eventually go home. There's going to be a greater and greater emphasis on what skills shortages can they fill here in Canada, even though most of them will go home. And I think that's a tension that, as you say, that conflict between the demand, the students, the things that students want to study and the demands and skill shortages back home versus, us trying to, or the Canadian government perhaps trying to funnel everyone into particular programs. We'll have to come to grips with that, and I think that'll be a bit of an adjustment. Um, it's an adjustment for the entire sort of recruitment process as well, because students will come with a particular uh, course in mind, and we'll have to sort of look at ways on how to shift that. I think the other thing that's going to be really important, again, that you mentioned, if the government comes and says we need more teachers, they will potentially be looking for universities that can point to strong international student graduates getting very good employment outcomes in the teaching profession. If you can demonstrate that at the time when the need arises, then you're in a box seat for some potentially favorable policies that might blow in your direction. You might even be invited to the table to help shape those policies. To your point, I think the tech sector has been, of all the sort of anti-immigration rhetoric that's coming out of the US, Trump had that wild idea of giving STEM graduates a green card. I think it's no accident there that, there's a really strong alignment between the need, the powerful voices, and then the policies that may eventuate out of it. So yeah, that's a space to watch.
Thanks, John. Well, no one else has come in with any questions, so I think we should probably wind it down and then give you your afternoons back. Just want to say that I think, John and I both work for commercial companies, but we're, I think, both very generous with our time and insight. So always happy to have a chat about what you're seeing, tell you what we know. I think uh, I speak for both of us on that. Um, Thanks for joining us, and we do hope we hear from you.